Well, I don't think I need to tell you what we all know so clearly and acutely, that there are just so many issues that are going on in the world, internationally, domestically, that it's hard for us to keep our balance with everything that is going on. And I want to try to address some of these issues tonight and to make some suggestions. It turns out that in our regular poetry group, which meets regularly Thursday afternoons, among the 4 poems that we read and looked at carefully are 2 which we all agreed during our session speak also to today's issues. And so I want to quote from 2 of these poems just to kind of indicate that these poets had a sense of not the particulars of our current malaise, but something about, unfortunately, the general nature of things which raises its head all too often. You'll be familiar with at least one of these poems, I'm sure. And I'm not going to read the entire poem, but just the relevant part. The first comes from William Butler Yeats's great The Second Coming. And here's what he says and writes in the first stanza. And Yeats wrote this poem in 1920, just after the end of World War I, the Russian Revolution, the Easter Uprising in Ireland. So he also was reeling during those times. And here's what he writes. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Could have been written yesterday. The second is an equally famous poem, written 70 years before Yeats wrote his poem, and this one is by Matthew Arnold, Dover Beach, which he wrote in 1850. And among the things that he says before I'm going to read in the conclusion, he alludes to what he names the eternal note of sadness and the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. And here's how he ends this poem. As he looks out the window with his new bride, he calls her to the window. And he says, "Ah, love, let us be true to one another. For the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain." Powerful evocations. And I want to discuss briefly 2 of the issues that are facing us at this time: the war against Hamas and the rise of anti-Semitism. We know the statistics. A month ago tomorrow, that makes this the Shloshim, 30 days after that barbaric invasion, 30 days ago, Hamas soldiers left 1,400 Israelis dead, and so many of them savaged. There are still 242 hostages still being held by Hamas, though the IDF now surrounds Gaza, while the pressure on Israel to pause intensifies. And the last time I looked, Prime Minister Netanyahu refuses to bring these hostilities to a pause. If you want to know my opinion about it, though I certainly recognize Israel's right and need to do all that it can to wipe out the forces of Hamas, I still myself believe that a pause would be a good thing, 2 or 3 days, in order to minimize civilian casualties. And now that the IDF surrounds Gaza, a pause becomes the more plausible in my view. The second issue that I want to raise is the issue of anti-Semitism. And I want to quote this morning's Plain Dealer. Anti-Semitic incidents have soared since the war began, and the conflict has bitterly divided dozens of campuses, including Harvard University, Stanford University, the University of Pennsylvania, and Columbia University. At Cornell University, a series of anti-Semitic incidents culminated in a junior engineering student being charged with making online death threats to Jewish students. A swastika was found drawn in Columbia's International Affairs building, and videos have circulated of what appears to be Harvard students harassing a Jewish student during anti-Israel protests, end quote. Not only is this appalling in its own terms, but here we are dealing with the creme de la creme of American universities, the elite universities, where only 3 or 4% of applicants are admitted to the school, indicating that these are the students with not only the most accomplishment, but the greatest aptitude, the greatest potential for further development and further contributions to the well-being of our country, which makes it tragically laughable that just at those universities, these awful incidents are taking place. Just another, I hate to say it, but just another piece of evidence that at the top of the pyramid, the American higher education system is deeply troubled and deeply problematic. In response, we have to say that the presidents of these colleges have been egregiously slow in directly confronting the problem. Though now, according again to the Plain Dealer, several of these universities have announced task forces on anti-Semitism. I see a bit of irony in this, but nevertheless, it's a good thing. Here's what I think about this. First of all, the extraordinary asymmetry between criticism of Hamas and criticism of Israel. So little on campuses and elsewhere do we hear the hues and the cries about what Hamas did on October 7th. And so much the more criticism of Israel. And it strikes me that this asymmetry and this excess is itself a symptom of anti-Semitism. Criticism is valid if one has good reasons for it, and if those reasons would be applied to any other people or country involved in the same thing. That's what we call rationality. If there's a reason, the reason should be universally applied. And the excess and the asymmetry is an example of anti-Semitism raising its ugly head once again. And as you may know, anti-Semitism is more than 2,000 years old. It did not begin with the New Testament. It did not begin with some manifestations of Christianity. It was already manifest in Alexandria and in the Roman Empire long before. Christianity, of course, gave it a life that will not go away as long as the following two passages from the Gospels are being read. And I want to quote them. From the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27. Matthew has the Jews saying about themselves and their future, his blood, Jesus' blood, be upon us and upon our children forever. And in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, you, he's pointing to the Jews, are of your father the devil, and your will to have Jesus killed is to do your father's desires. Now, these passages are read regularly. The New Testament is quoted every Sunday in churches. And when these passages are read, contextualizing them in terms of the situation of the day, which doesn't make them less execrable, but reduces the claim of universality, which merely reading them suggests. And I want to pose a caution here that certain Christian churches, and certainly many, many of our Christian neighbors and friends, decry these passages and vow not to read them, use them, or believe them any longer. But when they're read in churches without context and without comment, they can still do their very ugly work. And from that point on, 2,000 years ago, anti-Semitism has taken many, many forms throughout history. Forms that are social, that are economic, that are cultural, that are religious, and at the end of the 19th century, that took on a new form, racial anti-Semitism. As ugly as religious anti-Semitism is, there was always, if I can put it this way, a way out for Jews converting to Christianity. If anti-Semitism is based on race, there is no way out. The most heinous of all of its forms. That being said, I want to say nevertheless that I am somewhat heartened, though I'm not naive about it, by some of the reactions of our community. And some of these reactions, I think, are without much precedent, which is part of what heartens me about it. The strong rebuke by President Biden and other officials. And here is something else that I read in this morning's Plain Dealer, and I quote, 24 top U.S. law firms sent a letter to more than 100 law school deans telling them to take an unequivocal stance against anti-Semitic harassment on campus. The letter, which was signed by several law firms, comes after some law students saw their job offers rescinded for comments made about Hamas's brutal October 7th attacks. We are asking, the dean said, for university administrators to create a safe environment for all their students where one is treated with respect. That's what we require for all of our firms. So I think this is a very important statement, and we're seeing many of them where job acceptances have been revoked if those students are demonstrated to have been involved in anti-Semitic attacks. And what about free speech? Is this a way of trying to curb and silence free speech? Absolutely not. The right to speak remains, but there are consequences, not only to actions, but to speech. And those consequences flow from the actions, and therefore this in no way is an inhibition of free speech, but merely taking into account what it is people are saying. So we have two very troubling situations, both of which have victimized Jews in one way or another. And what should we do? What can we say about this? And I'd like to make a couple of suggestions. First, we can stay vigilant and up to date about what is happening in our country and in the Middle East. We have to understand the situation, both in their straightforward meanings and in their complexities. Secondly, we must do what we can to help our brethren in Israel. So I encourage you to do one or more of the following. Check our temple website for how to participate in the letter writing campaign to our local representatives, to encourage them in their support, and to urge them to influence those in power. Secondly, we can check the Jewish Federation of Cleveland's website to find out how to donate to the Israel Emergency Campaign. Thirdly, we can refer to the Community Mobilization Center Resource Hub for the latest talking points, tools, and resources to help us to speak up for Israel. And I want to suggest, and I've said this on several occasions before, I'm going to say it again. The Torah portions of the week are established long in advance according to the dictates of the calendar. But I'm always astonished at when we are confronted with a particular situation in our lives and in our society, that those Torah portions have something to say to us, as they do for most situations, public and private. And I want to suggest how this week's Torah portion, Vayera, chapters 18 through 22 of Genesis, speak to us. At the beginning of chapter 18, we find Abraham sitting in his doorway to his tent in the cool of the day. Just in the chapter before, Abraham circumcised his son Ishmael and himself. So he is now sitting and convalescing. We can well imagine that Abraham wants to be left alone, doesn't want to be bothered. But lo and behold, 3 strangers pass by, and Abraham welcomes them into his tent and offers them food. Not only does he offer them food and drink, he does the preparations with alacrity. On 3 or 4 moments in that narrative, Abraham is represented as running to get them food, running to put it before them, running to tell Sarah and his assistant to prepare food for them. He encourages Sarah to bake these things quickly, and he brings them the food to these individuals, and then he moves away from them and lets them eat in peace. Abraham welcomes wayfarers, welcomes the strangers. He does what he takes to be his duty, to reflect the dignity of all people, even those whom he doesn't know. And he does it not only, and this is what the running connotes, he does it not only with his hands, he not only performs the deeds, he does it with his heart. He means it. His motivation is pure. And the passage opens by saying that Abraham notices three strangers coming toward him, and he sees that God is making an appearance, is going to make an appearance before him. And the next verse suggests that Abraham puts the conversation with God aside to welcome and to serve the strangers. And the Torah says that even when we have an opportunity to have a moment of intimacy with God, that needs to be put aside in order to help other people, however familiar or however foreign. Many chapters and a generation later, when Abraham sends his senior assistant out to find a wife for his son Isaac, we find Rebekah replicating this very action by offering Eliezer drink and food. And she says, without being asked, "Let me water your camels as well." And then the Torah, as if in echo of what Abraham suggests, says, "And she ran to fulfill this task." I sometimes say to myself, and less often out loud, tongue-in-cheek, that if I were putting together the Avot V'Imahot prayer, I would begin it by saying, "Praised are you, Lord our God, and God of our ancestors, God of Abraham, Rebekah, and Jacob." Isaac is no small figure, but Rebekah deserves a place among the patriarchs. Later in that chapter, Abraham confronts God. God, as you remember, is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. But he takes Abraham into his counsel, and he tells Abraham what he's about to do. And Abraham, because of his deep commitment to justice, thinks that what God is about to do may not be just. Now, if you and I were having a conversation with God, let us imagine, and God said to us, "You know what? I am going to now do X." And I might feel that X is the wrong thing for God to do. Am I going to take God on? Probably not. But Abraham does. And he says in a phrase that rings down through the generations, "Shall not the just one do what is just?" You are risking doing something that's not just, and I have to call you on it because you are the just one. Your essence, your very definition is your commitment to justice. And I'm going to tell you that you are not living up to who you are. Notice what Abraham is suggesting here, that God, who we might say has more power than any entity on earth, that God's power is not to be taken as absolute. God's fundamental essence, according to Abraham, is not God's will, but God's wisdom. That God, God's self, can be judged over and against standards. And so Abraham, in chapter 18, in our Torah portion, stands for hospitality regarding the humanity and the need of every individual, and he also stands for justice, that we must stand up against injustice and insist that the world move toward more and more of it. So it seems to me that in difficult times, We have to reckon with the particularities of the problems to understand and to act. But we can also always learn from our millennially relevant tradition. To be like Abraham, to be like Rebekah, who under duress lived their values. They cared for others, not only in deed, but in the purity of their motivation, not only with their hands, but also with their hearts. They helped others through the goodness of their hearts, and not because they expected something in return, doing it so that they may do to us. Remember that both Abraham and Rebekah ran to do what they thought was right. And so I encourage us to be like Abraham, who under duress stood for his values, for justice, for fairness, for compassion. He maintained his standards, even if by doing so, he would be in some way make it easier on some of the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah. Because by doing this, Abraham and Rebekah maintained their integrity. And if one maintains one's integrity, one also has, as an implication, a sense of optimism, even in difficult and dark times. Because knowing what is right and doing what is right, even if others are not doing the same, gives us a legitimate purchase on the future. And therefore, we must be like Abraham and Rebekah, even in difficult and challenging times like these.